Candace Matelic, speaking on successful interpretive planning.
Along with collections and preservation, interpretation is one of the basic fundamental responsibilities of history museums and historic sites. Like collections management, interpretation requires a conscious, planned effort and regular monitoring to be successful. Interpretive planning simply means preparing what you want to communicate and how you want to communicate it before it just cosmically happens. Before we discuss the specifics of this what and how, let us briefly consider interpretation as a communication process between the museum, historical society, or historic site and the visitor. As a communication process, it can be analyzed according to this model. In every communication process, we begin with a sender and end with a receiver. In between, we have a message and a channel. These four steps are connected by a feedback loop because in communication and interpretation is a two-way process between the sender and the receiver. Now let's relate this communication model to the interpretive process in history museums by making history museums our sender and visitors our receiver. What is the message? It's not art or science, but history. Not the entire history of man's civilization or the entire history of America or Canada, but rather a focused aspect of history, whether local or regional or 19th century, colonial, or the decade 1910 to 1920. The history your museum covers must be somehow defined in place and time. Next, what are our channels? Here we list our rich communication vocabulary: staff, objects, both historical artifacts and reproduction items, buildings, both historical and modern neutral spaces, environment, or the outdoor or indoor space which provides a context for historical buildings or artifacts, exhibits, supplementing human interpretation, audiovisual, materials including films, slides, tapes, signs, and labels, publications, from brochures and guidebooks to scholarly monographs, and process, demonstrations, the numerous forms of living history, and structured programs for both children and adults. How does interpretive planning fit into this process? If you isolate the two center parts of our communication model, the message and the channel, and define those aspects or your museum's communication to visitors, you are in essence preparing the what and the how of your interpretation. Or, in other words, interpretive planning means defining the message and channels in this communication process. Let's examine the message and channel functions more closely, beginning with your message. The first question you must ask is, have you defined your museum's message? Your message begins with a statement of purpose, which is clearly written and approved by your Board of Trustees. Utilizing this statement as a framework, then begin to clarify your historical scope and story. Start simple and eliminate the obvious, such as the history of man's civilization. Be careful that your focus is neither too broad nor too narrow. As a useful checkpoint, ask a few more questions. 1. Does the history mean anything to the audience you intend to serve through your purpose? Ask yourself, so what? Who cares? What's the point? So what if you think the history is interesting? Will a general audience agree? 2. The second question relates the message to the channel, because part of your research must involve a critical analysis of your collections to determine whether they can support your historical message or focus. Ask, how does your museum's collection illustrate the story you want to communicate? These two things must match up, and if they do not, Then you must either reevaluate the message or change, develop, or refine the collections. When you are researching your historical scope and story, and only research will answer the questions just asked, remember that research for interpretation is different than research for pure curatorial documentation. Both are concerned with the who, what, when, and where, but interpretive research is concentrated primarily on larger issues, or the why questions. These questions are important and also the most challenging. In answering the why questions, you clarify the interpretive significance of objects, sites, or exhibits. The interpretive significance gives meaning to factual information and answers the so what factor. Your historical scope and story becomes an overall interpretive theme, which provides a unifying framework for your collections. Once your interpretive message is in order and the research information is organized, the next step is choosing the method or channel of communication. Why does this step follow rather than precede the clarification of message? Simply because the message dictates the method. Let's explore this idea further. The process involved in choosing an interpretive channel, or method or technique of communication, begins with discussing your interpretive message and brainstorming the many ways to get the message across to the visitors. This brainstorming stage is crucial and should not be overlooked or taken for granted. Involve as many staff as workable. List as many possibilities as you can think of. Be as creative and outlandish as you dare. And do not be restricted conceptually by the realistic constraints of money, time, space, or staff. Dream. There are many, many approaches to interpretation. Each one is valid and has its strengths and weaknesses. If you consider these channels or methods in terms of how they may help to tell your particular special story, you will soon eliminate some approaches as totally inappropriate. Others will begin to appear very plausible and exciting. The two basic categories of interpretive methods are those involving human interpretation and those without staff. While there is no replacement for direct human-to-human contact, some interpretive messages, or portions thereof, are most effectively communicated through formal exhibits or the printed word. Topics such as industrialization and factory production, or broad sweeping change in American cities, may need graphics and films or slides to supplement artifacts and human discussion. Many subjects warrant the in-depth scholarly consideration that only a publication can provide. On the other hand, if you choose to supplement formal exhibits with human interpretive staff, whether volunteer or paid, you are faced with another set of options concerning how the staff interact with visitors. Does your subject matter need the connections and transitions that occur during a structured guided tour? Is it logistically much simpler due to crowd size, traffic patterns, or numbers of staff to invite visitors to wander on their own and encounter your interpretive staff at regular punctuations along the way? If staff are stationed in this fashion, are they in uniform or modern dress, serving as a narrator or commentator to the exhibit, area, or building? Do they have artifacts and photographs to use as teaching tools? Are they engaged in a demonstration of a significant process or related activity? If you are working with historic sites, have you defined these sites to show a specific time and place? Or perhaps you want to show developments or changes over a period of time? In each case, the message dictates the appropriate interpretive approach. A living history format, where interpretive staff dress in period clothing and follow a regular daily, weekly, or seasonal routine of activities which correspond to a specific time, place, and function, can be a very powerful communication technique. It can be done in a third-person approach or a first-person role-playing mode. But living history is also very expensive and time-consuming in terms of staff training, consumable supplies, and constant monitoring if you do it correctly and effectively. Thus, before jumping into this channel or any other, you must decide whether the method really helps you to communicate your particular story. Another important aspect of interpretive planning to consider, right from the early brainstorming stages, is how involved your visitors can get in the channel or channels you choose. Is there an activity that visitors can participate in? Is it possible for visitors to help staff do a process or make something to take home? All of these possibilities must be evaluated for their strengths and weaknesses in terms of your resources. This is how you bring your creative brainstorming juices back to earth and reality. What do we mean by evaluating resources? Here's a few examples. Physical space or type of site. Large, small, indoor, outdoor. Staff. Needed to build exhibits, talk to visitors in buildings, lead tours, do demonstrations, conduct structured programs, or even produce written and audiovisual materials. Artifacts, reproductions, and equipment. What do you have? What can you acquire? Fiscal resources. Budget for staff, artifacts, consumable materials, written support materials. And finally, energy. Do you have enough to implement what you dream, especially considering all of your other concurrent projects? Or can your ideas be implemented in stages or phases? How creatively you utilize these resources or channels determines how effectively your message is transmitted to visitors. You will probably find that utilizing only one channel does not completely satisfy your interpretive needs. So choose a combination of approaches to try. Experiment with a number of methods. Learn by doing. And do not fret if at first the method or channel is not working. Relax and try again. It takes time, patience, and much flexibility to discover just the right combination of approaches for your particular museum. Whatever channels you decide on to communicate your message, do not forget why you are concerned with interpretive planning in the first place. Do not forget to connect to your receiver, literally. Whatever your message and whatever your channel, use active language. Ask questions to challenge your audience to relate the message to their own 20th century world. And explore through the senses. Finally, remember the feedback loop in this model. More importantly, remember that interpretation as a communication process is a shared experience between the museum and the visitor.